This is episode 331 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. And Wally, hopefully this doesn't get our podcast here banned from Facebook or YouTube, but we're going to start off with a COVID-related news item from New York, the magazine. The title, Science of Masking Kids at School Remains Uncertain, August 20th, 2021. And just reading from a few of the initial paragraphs of this report, at the end of May, the CDC published a notable yet mostly ignored large-scale study of COVID transmission in American schools. A few major news outlets covered its release by briefly reiterating the study's summary that masking then unvaccinated teachers and improving ventilation with more fresh air were associated with the lower incidence of the virus in schools. It went on, and this is just the beginning paragraphs, to say that other findings of equal importance in the study, however, were absent and not widely reported. These findings cast doubt on the impact of many of the most common mitigation measures in American schools: distancing, hybrid models, classroom barriers, HEPA filters, and most notably requiring student masking. This is the CDC's own study, Wally, and to say the report later on goes to detail about why we didn't hear about it, but basically claims that the report was, quote, file drawered, which means that if the publishers of a study don't like what it says, they don't necessarily not publish the entire study, but they treat those findings in a way that is not representative of how important or relevant they are.
Yeah, just this is just the latest in a long line of the follow the science, quote unquote science. It's interesting, Paul. I'm seeing more reports that, fresh air and air exchange is important, but, where's the science on all this? And it's just very interesting. What is reported, what is not, what is studied, what is not. There's no question that, masks bring a certain gravity to the situation. We're wearing masks, things are dangerous. I only wish there was more evidence that they were effective. And I think that that's something that should be studied more. I think I mentioned in our previous podcast, there was a Journal of the American Medical Association, quote unquote, study on mask use, which was the most anecdotal. It wasn't the double-blind study. We haven't seen very many, if any of those, with regards to masks, much less other interventions like filters, air exchange, other things like that.
Yeah, and as the parent of 3 kids in school who it pains me greatly to have them forced to wear masks every day, even though none of them now go to traditional public schools. All the schools in New Mexico, except for maybe a select few who are really willing to stand up to the governor, are requiring masks. So it's very difficult to avoid. Pretty much homeschooling is the only option for parents who really want to keep their kids unmasked during the school day. And speaking of masks and COVID-19, you can kind of tell the trajectory of the virus and its variants and whatnot from the way our podcasts wind up covering the subject. David Clements, who was a NMSU professor, recently was fired from the university for being unwilling to both get the vaccine and wear a mask in the classroom. And, David definitely marches to the beat of his own drummer, very courageous guy, whether you agree with everything he says. And we talked about, Trump and the last election and whatnot. Somebody who does not have tenure, and I'd be interested, to see if a professor at NMSU with tenure uh, was willing to stand up in the same way. But David, from our conversation at least, did not have tenure. And now he's no longer with NMSU because he refused to comply with both of those rules imposed ultimately by the university, but really Governor Lujan Grisham has kind of been the one ultimately pushing those. And yeah, it's a crazy world out there, Wally.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And he was, I don't know what you would call it, award winning. He was one of one of the favorite NMSU professors. And it's interesting. When I was there, a lot of the favorite professors came out of engineering, out of business and economics as well. There's a lot of good things. You can really have some engaging classes. It sounds like he was an engaging professor, but not with the Aggies anymore. So.
Yeah, and that'll be a developing story for sure to see what happens with David Clements. Might be better served by not being involved in a state institution for sure. State of New Mexico institution, particular among them. It's a very interesting world out there, and I don't envy folks who have to make the decision whether they want to get the vaccine if they're concerned about it. And we've talked about it. You and I have gotten the vaccine willingly, although neither of us, to my knowledge, certainly not myself, and you as well, work for the government. So it's respectful. It's something that we respect, that folks may want to make their own health decisions, but that is not the way this governor and obviously a large number of institutions around our state are doing things. And speaking of another institution that is facing some dramatic changes due to the governor's policies, the state fair, which is coming up here in just a few weeks at the fairgrounds, the Expo New Mexico in Albuquerque, is requiring vaccinations. They had a recent event at the state fairgrounds. Pride Fest was one of the most recent events, which is of course a celebration of LBGT rights, etc. Now, that was not sponsored by the state of New Mexico. That was either the city of Albuquerque or some other institution sponsoring that. But the fair is a state event, and the governor is requiring a vaccine for any child 12 years or older, or child or adult. And that means that kids who are displaying animals may not be able to present. And just again, a sad situation, a difficult situation, especially for these kids and families. And there is some good news, but I wanted to get your take on the fair situation first, Wally.
Well, I continue to have the concern that, the health orders in New Mexico are broad and far-reaching, and there's not a lot of details about how you comply with it. So, what am I going to have to do? Can I show my picture of my vaccination card on my phone, which I took one because I figure, I don't know what's going to be required for things to travel, and otherwise, do I have to show an identification? Is somebody there to do it? And because of how the checks are going to go and the fact that we still haven't heard what's required or how it's going to work, are there going to be lines that make the state fair, in addition to being difficult to attend because of the requirements to show your vaccination status, huge lines? And you see that in all kinds of events, without checking for COVID vaccinations, things get hit with a whole lot of people coming at one time, and you end up standing in line for a long, long time. And unlike at Disney World, there isn't Splash Mountain at the end. It's the state fair. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it definitely seems that the governor has, in pretty typical style over the span of COVID. She has laid down her diktats, and she's going to make the folks at the fair and anybody else kind of deal with the situation. And that could be a very challenging problem, how you actually really verify that people have been vaccinated. ID checks at the door is my assumption, but what exactly qualifies is open to interpretation. And I've read the order multiple times because I was just trying to figure out whether my kids, who are all younger than 12 and not eligible for the vaccine, would be able to attend the fair or not. And it appears that they would be, but a lot of those kids displaying animals, even if they had the intention of getting the vaccine, if they hadn't gotten it by the time the governor issued her order for the mandate and they were getting one of the double dose vaccines, they wouldn't have been physically able to do both in time for the fair. Now, I guess the good news is that the fair's livestock shows will go on at a new expo in Roswell, New Mexico. So young people who might have missed the opportunity to come up to Albuquerque and participate in the same state fair will have the opportunity to go to Roswell, and we'll see how it all goes. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch what the attendance is like at the fair in Albuquerque, as well as just what generally happens. Will the lines be around the block? Will there be issues in terms of that and other factors at the fair that maybe are unforeseen? Because there's a lot of moving parts there, and we'll just see what indeed happens. And we're still not done yet with the old COVID issue, Wally. A protest, a lot of medical workers showed up, but certainly a lot of concerned citizens as well came out in downtown Albuquerque for a protest against, and some of these protests, it's hard to say exactly what's going on, but the protest was mostly, I think, against the vaccine mandates, but also against the mask mandates. Of course, yours truly was in attendance downtown. It was right near Civic Plaza in downtown Albuquerque. It wasn't the only such protest around the state. I know Las Cruces, I saw pictures there. I took pictures myself and placed them at errorsoфenchantment.com. I estimated the crowd at about 500 folks. It was definitely a significant protest. A lot of people out waving signs on the streets of downtown Albuquerque. And there were definitely dozens of healthcare professionals. There were also a few dozen firefighters and some other government employees, not just the healthcare professionals, but definitely not every profession has a uniform. You see somebody wearing scrubs, and I guess you can assume that they may be a doctor or health professional. You see somebody wearing a International Association of Firefighters t-shirt and hanging out with other firefighters, and you think, well, they're probably firefighters. And then other government employees don't necessarily have the same kinds of uniforms. But I guess what I'm getting at is that it wasn't necessarily just a protest. There were a significant number of people who directly are impacted by this. And of course, with the shortage of nurses and folks in the medical profession, for a variety of reasons, right now, it is something that I've heard from people around the state. They're very concerned that we're going to be losing health professionals who refuse the vaccine at the worst possible time.
Well, I find it very interesting that the group of people who are PhDs are the least likely to want to get the vaccine. And then, there's a lot of there's a lot of positioning and rhetoric out there is like, if you just understood, you would get the vaccine. It's interesting. It would be hard to imagine a healthcare worker, maybe, I don't know, maybe if you're a dental hygienist, and nothing against dental hygienists, but, they're not on the front lines of COVID. But, a lot of these healthcare workers obviously know what's going on and have made the call that they don't want it. The other thing that's interesting is that I'm reading now that the immunity granted by having COVID is 15 times greater than the vaccine. And, who knows, maybe some of these healthcare workers, you don't know what anyone's status is from a ability to fight off COVID. And again, there's the other issue that I'm reading is that if you've had the vaccine, it's easier for you to carry high loads of it, but not have symptoms. So, this is a very, very complicated issue. And there are a lot of people fighting back against the one size fits all, and there's no choice involved with it. And again, to reiterate, I got my vaccine. Maybe I got it a little early. I didn't get my $100, but I've got the 2-dose, and I at this point am personally, for what it's worth, and I mean, it's probably not worth very much. It's like, I think that that's probably been a good thing for me, but we will have to wait and see what happens. The long-term effects of the vaccine versus the short-term effects of benefits from COVID, that will play out. And it looks like, unfortunately, Paul, it will not play out over the next few weeks or months. It'll play out over many, many years at the rate we're going.
Yeah, no doubt that it doesn't seem like the situation is going away anytime soon. In fact, most experts are predicting that New Mexico is going to be on the upward trajectory of COVID-19 for a while. I'm coming to you from Florida, from a conference I'm attending as part of the State Policy Network. Of course, Florida and Ron DeSantis have been in the eye of the proverbial hurricane. They're not in the eye of that hurricane. Ida's over by Louisiana, and my flight yesterday had to circumnavigate the hurricane and its impacts. But Florida in particular has been a different state when it comes to COVID-19. They were severely impacted by the Delta variant, despite an admirable job of vaccination, especially of its senior citizens. But yeah, who knows? These things change so quickly, and it's hard to say what is the right approach as an individual in terms of vaccines and various other measuring sticks. And just to finalize that particular note, a lot of folks I interact with on the political left ask me and other conservatives, why don't you push the vaccine, say, hey, you should get vaccinated. I tell people I am vaccinated, but I don't try to tell other people what to do in their lives. And I think this is kind of the celebrity endorsement aspect of politics here. You see on the left all kinds of celebrities come out, rock the vote and various other things. Go vote. It's a liberal cause celeb, and you get all these Hollywood types and others. They'll promote anything, vaccines, voting, whatever it may be, that's politically correct at the time. Whereas, it's just not the conservative or libertarian approach to say, I did this, you should do this too. And I think that's a political difference between the two sides of the spectrum that is not fully understood by the other side of the spectrum. So most self-identified conservatives and libertarians are not going to go out and hector people on their side of the aisle to go do whatever it may be. And it just is a problem. It's a challenge. Now, Wally, I don't know if you've got the video queued up or you were able to play this short video, but our final COVID-related news item, I believe, is really excellent statement by Calvary Church pastor Skip Heitzig. Now, I'm sure there are other religious figures and other figures in our community that are saying things like this, but Calvary Church is a very significant church in the Albuquerque community. We have at the Rio Grande Foundation been able to appear on their radio show, Albuquerque Connect. It's hosted by Jim Williams, and it's 88.3 FM, but also streaming all over the world. And it's worth checking out because I'm proud of a lot of the conversations I've had with Jim over the last year or two. But Skip Heitzig really gave a statement on COVID, the governor's orders, and just how to live your life that I think is worth listening to. So if you got that queued up, Wally.
I do not. It's one of those. I ran it, and I think our bandwidth is such that I could play it, but it'd be very jerky. But Paul, I could cut that into the video. So
perfect. Yeah. It's again at errorsoфenchantment.com. It's about a 1.5-minute video, and it's Skip Heitzig just talking to the camera, saying essentially, whether you're vaccinated, unvaccinated, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, that is your right, that is your opinion, and you should be able to do that. We won't kick you out of the church or anything if you don't feel that is a decision that you want to make.
Yeah, Paul. When you were talking about the celebrity endorsement approach to things, it reminded me of Wayne's World. It's almost like cheeky product placement. It's like, I have ask me about my experience with the COVID vaccination, and it's one of those things. It's interesting. Anecdotes are not double-blind studies, but it's interesting how we switch back and forth between what's appropriate messaging and what are appropriate questions with regard to the path forward with Corona.
Yeah, and I lied. We still have one more COVID-related item on the agenda, and that is mask policies for school children by state. Again, burbio.com, or actually, Burbio, burbio.com is the place to go. You can find a school mask policy tracker that is updated very regularly. New Mexico is among the states that have a mask mandate in place, and those states include Hawaii, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Louisiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And you have other states that have banned mask mandates, and other states that have given local flexibility, which is quite frankly a majority of the states. And then you have 3 now, like I said, this has been recently updated, where mask mandate bans have been overturned by the courts. And if we were in Texas, Arkansas, or Florida, I promise you we would be having a lot of attorneys on to discuss the policies there. It's fascinating, not to get too far afield, but conservatives often wonder why courts, judges, Supreme Court especially, it seems like you get a hit or miss ratio of maybe 50 or so percent, where conservatives wind up being happy with about 1 of every 2 justices named to the US Supreme Court by a conservative president. But liberals never disappoint. They always come up and vote essentially for the most left-wing policies imaginable. And it doesn't seem to stop at the state level, where I don't think there's been a successful challenge to a mask mandate from the top down. But you have now 3 states where judges have overturned a ban on masks, ban on mask mandates. Again, nobody's banning masks in the classroom. Kids can show up to school wearing a mask in all 50 states across the country. The difference is in Texas, Arkansas, and Florida, well, both prior and other states, dozens of other states, you had a ban on forced masking, but unfortunately, these judges have in those states decided that a mask mandate at the local level is perfectly okay. I suspect we're not going to get a judge saying, that the reverse is true, that the governor can't mandate a mask in our schools, whether it's Floyd, New Mexico, or some other district.
No, I tend to agree with you. And, there's this thing called judicial restraint, and it tends to be somewhat of a one-way street where, you know, allowing people choice tends to be overridden quite a bit by the courts in general recently in America, and the erring on the side of freedom, liberty, and personal choice and responsibility tends to be getting a little bit less. A little bit less love by the courts, and here is a pretty striking example in 3 states.
Yeah. Okay. We are finally beyond the COVID portion of our show, at least directly COVID. It hovers over everything we do, so it's never something we are truly done with. But specifically, and this would probably be the top issue we dealt with in a normal non-COVID related week, whatever those look like in the long distant past. But on Friday, the Albuquerque Journal ran a column or an article, and there's been meetings up in Taos Ski Valley for legislators to hear about different issues in our state, specifically, in this case, the amount of money flowing into New Mexico. And to say that money is indeed flowing into the state. And we alluded to this. We've talked about how despite the lockdown economy, despite the high unemployment rate, New Mexico was likely going to be doing very well as COVID, well, we felt COVID receded in the past, but the worst of the COVID restrictions and kind of the collapse in oil prices back in April 2020 receded into the rearview mirror. To say that oil and gas revenues have come back strong is definitely an understatement, and we now have an estimated $8.8 billion for those legislators in Santa Fe to spend in the upcoming year. Record-breaking revenues and just growing at a rapid pace. And I'll just say this before I throw it over to you, Wally. The confluence, which is pretty rare when you have relatively high prices, and barrel price of oil has been in the $60, sometimes $70 range, hovering in that area for quite a number of weeks or even months. And then production has really been driving this boom in oil production and oil revenues. And then top it all off with a dollop, if you will, of natural gas prices being really much higher than they had been for quite a while. All of those have led to the state of New Mexico now having quite a bit of money flowing in for the upcoming legislative session, and just I don't see it slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, and Paul, one thing, we have the moratorium against permitting on federal lands, but as I've made the point a few times, that is going to be a very delayed in terms of totally slowing down the industry. And right now, New Mexico has 81 active drilling rigs. So, they've been over 100, but 81 is a lot of drilling rigs. So you're right. It is right now led by production, but we're also getting a lot of revenue from, 81 drilling rigs is a huge gross receipts tax generator for the state of New Mexico and local areas. And what I find fascinating is we find ourselves in a very similar position as to when Bill Richardson was governor, and that is a lot of policies were enacted that actually slowed the industry down, but it didn't really slow the industry down until after Bill Richardson was governor. And we find ourselves flush with oil and gas money. And then the big question is, what are we going to do to quote unquote invest this money? You know, is it going to be things that are going to help our economy long term, or are we going to, fritter it away with diffused, largely unnecessary projects? And I know they're talking general fund money here, but there's also a capital outlay component. And if you want to see something that's inefficient, look at New Mexico's capital outlay process. They allow the governor and legislators an amount. There's tons of only very partially funded projects. And so, this amount of money we have now, heaven forbid, we could do something like reform our gross receipts tax system or do some things that would really put the state on the road to a higher level of long-term economic growth and development. But we will wait and see what great ideas they come up with in Santa Fe, and whether they even talk about that, or is it just going to be, like there's a thing in economics, roughly in layman's terms, it's the found money syndrome. Are they going to treat this as found money? And people who consider money to be found aren't nearly as judicious with it as if they had to earn that money. And I think that's been a problem with a lot of the oil and gas money in New Mexico over the years. Is it's like, well, this is a freebie. It doesn't matter how efficiently and how effectively we spend it.
Yeah, I would echo that, of course, and say that, done right, gross receipts tax reform should reduce state revenue slightly, but you can do it largely in a revenue neutral fashion. I would say it's a minimal cost in terms of lost revenue to the state of New Mexico. And I know cost is obviously a fraught way to talk about it, but you're reducing revenues slightly. You could eliminate the state's corporate income tax, which is highly unlikely given the progressive nature of the legislature, but you could do that. That's, again, lost revenue on the order of $30 to $40 million annually. Very small fraction of the state's overall revenue prospects. And Social Security tax could be eliminated as well. Again, not a whole lot of money flowing into the state of New Mexico from that. And yes, I recognize that oil and gas revenues are volatile. That is why we especially have encouraged legislators and the state in general to diversify. And to diversify, you need to actually make yourself business friendly so that people want to come here and invest and do business in your state. It's not, oh, we need to create new taxes and gain additional revenue from additional sources. It's, gee, let's actually make New Mexico a business-friendly place. Of course, between our governor and the majorities in both houses of the legislature, they have absolutely zero track record of anything that makes New Mexico more attractive to business. We've seen a tax increase last session on healthcare policies, health insurance. We saw 2019 HB6 raised a slew of different taxes, including personal incomes, including vehicle sales. So there's been a reverse trend in terms of tax hikes. We've seen tax hikes, not tax reductions, even when revenues have been very strong throughout most of Lujan Grisham's administration. And I think that gets to one of the unfortunate points about oil and gas in general. And this isn't to say oil and gas are bad or the industry is bad, but oil and gas march to the beat of their own drummer, especially when you have new formations found, new areas to drill and generate oil and gas production. You aren't necessarily reflecting the state's actual economic policies. And you talked about Richardson. Well, Richardson was a uh, disciple of Milton Friedman compared to Lujan Grisham in terms of his pro-business, pro-free market reforms. And mostly I would point to his really significant income tax cuts that took our top rate from 8.2% down to 4.9%. We've since backtracked slightly under the current governor, and there was legislation proposed that passed the House that would have done a whole lot more to do to undermine that. But anyway, the point is that if you actually had economic conditions reflect the policies in place, our revenues would be way, way down at the state level. In fact, as we alluded to before, you have this situation where unemployment is still among the highest in the country, and yet the government is, awash in revenue, and it really sets up some perverse incentives for the policymakers of the state of New Mexico. And I do fear that they'll just waste the money as they have so often in the past.
Yeah, and there's the concept about the curse of oil, and it's more from a third world country point of view, where countries like Nigeria have a lot of resources, but they aren't able to use it to develop their economy. It's just hopelessly corrupt, and I don't know. I won't call New Mexico Nigeria. Don't get me wrong. I love New Mexico, and we're not there yet at this point. But it is interesting that you're right. When you have, in the words of the Beverly Hillbillies song, "Up through the ground came a bubbling crude," and believe me, it just doesn't flow up through the ground. They have to do a lot of work to get it there. But yes, our economy is flush with cash, even though our economy, broadly speaking, isn't doing well. Whereas in a place like Utah, a place like Arizona, even a place like California, if the general economy was at the level that it is in New Mexico, they would feel it in their state houses with regard to how much state revenue they had to spend.
Well, they would not only feel it in the state houses, they would feel it on the streets. They would feel it in the economy. You would feel it in your pocketbooks as a citizen. And I think that is the major difference. And no, New Mexico may not be quite on Nigeria's level. We may not even be on Venezuela's level, or Saudi Arabia's level, or Iraq's level, or Iran's level, or Russia's level. But there's a long list of nations that have weak institutions that have allowed tremendous prosperity coming out of the ground to be frittered away. And I would just say that relative to the rest of the United States, we are a lot more of the Venezuela than we are the Norway or England. And those are two additional countries that have tremendous oil wealth, but have used it in a much more worthwhile fashion. So it's all relative, and New Mexico could do great things for its citizens. And by great things, I don't mean new government programs to spend all that money and still wind up in 50th place in education. I mean, to boost our economic growth, diversify our economy, make our state attractive to commerce and business and jobs. And then those trends, I believe, would actually do more to force improvements to our education system than any amount of money. If you have businesses and educated people coming into your state demanding and putting up money and saying, we're going to set up programs, we're going to do things probably outside of the education system itself that are going to force the system to improve, and we're going to demand those improvements through the political process, I think that's the more likely route to change and improve. But again, we've got a long history of just flushing that money down the proverbial toilet.
Yeah, and then I know tax cuts are very hard for this group in Santa Fe to get a handle on, but in lieu of that, maybe we could do an oil dividend this coming session. Just some rough math: $1 billion divided by 2 million New Mexicans, give or take. That's $500 for every man, woman, and child in New Mexico. Send us a check. That might not be a bad way to go as well.
Yeah, definitely a better approach than where we've gone in the past, for sure. So we're going to move up to Washington, D.C., and the policies of the Biden administration are certainly not among our preferred policies, but something that impacts New Mexico. And while oil and gas dominates in terms of the industries that our state really does well with, railroads are a group of businesses here in New Mexico that are really impactful. Of course, New Mexico's history with the railroads goes back close to 150 years. Famously, during the Carter administration, freight railroads were deregulated, and that meant companies could actually charge prices and manage their own infrastructure in ways that made more sense for them. We do have an integrated rail network, so there are times when, say, a Union Pacific train runs on BNSF track or vice versa. But the Biden administration almost touting the idea of free markets, which they issued this executive order back in July, Biden did, called Promoting Competition in the American Economy. And it has all kinds of executive orders, a few of which were good, like occupational licensing and pushing back against that, although that seems to be something that everyone agrees occupational licensing and the overuse of it is bad, but they actually have limited ways to really reform it. But one of the policies in this group of executive orders is called forced access. Forced access means that rather than the companies coming together, like the Norfolk Southerns, Union Pacifics, BNSFs, whatever, and having agreements on when trains can ride on the other railroads' tracks, the Biden administration is trying to mandate this and put the government in charge of it, which is a clear violation of property rights. And I talked to one advocate in the industry, and he said it's like net neutrality, but for railroads. And net neutrality is where the federal government wanted to tell all the internet service providers how internet traffic was going to work. It's just unnecessary. Jimmy Carter was right, and I'll go to my grave defending Jimmy Carter, at least relatively speaking, against some of the outrageous slings and arrows of folks, many on the right, who say that Jimmy Carter was just horrible. Well, Jimmy Carter, among other things, helped deregulate the railroads via what's called the Staggers Act. And we're going to have somebody in a few weeks, nothing planned specifically yet, but we're working to get somebody on our podcast here as an interview, talking about railroads and offering a little bit of insight onto what their impact is here in New Mexico. But you're talking about a private industry, fuel efficient, carbon emissions efficient, owns their own infrastructure, so they don't require government to maintain the railroads. And it's a really American success story. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is trying to undermine it with this rule. So again, posting at errorsoфenchantment.com for more information. You can even reach out to our members of Congress on it. But Wally, I want to give you your chance to weigh in here.
Yeah, it just makes me smile. It's like, policies like these are designed to quote unquote cure quote unquote inefficiency. And it's amazing. So is there some inefficiency in the freight market that this government program could help eliminate? Paul, absolutely. There's inefficiency everywhere. It just so happens that, just let's face it, besides all of the problems with the rule of law, which sometimes doesn't get enough attention, you just know this policy goes into effect. It will lead long term to the degradation of the rail system, not the support of it. So, I think this is a laughably horrible idea, and I'm with you. I hopefully this can be stopped because the rail system has really adapted well and is a very relevant thing. It's very efficient. The use of containers, so they truck the containers to the rail system and all that, and then to have the government come in and say we're here to help you. Just likely a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it is. It is a successful reform that's been in place for decades now, and it's something that we need as free market believers to, help continue and make sure that it doesn't slide backwards. And unfortunately, the Biden administration seems to want everything to slide backwards further and further, not just economically, but across the board. And it's sad to watch. So anyway, we are going to leave things there. I will have a full report on my trip to beyond the Berlin Wall to the free state of Florida and Orlando, and hearing from our friends in the free market movement from across the country. I'm hopeful that Mr. DeSantis might join us here in Orlando for our conference, at least to give a talk or something. That would be most excellent. And it's a state with a lot going on, a lot of people moving here. There was just nonstop construction all the way from the airport to the hotel, which was about a 20-minute drive. Just a state that's people are flocking to for obvious reasons. Zero income tax, right to work, low regulation, economically and ethnically diverse. It's an amazing state here. Humidity is not its best feature, though. So anyway, thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.